So,
So if I look at my mother's ancestry, um, as you know, I grew up in Namibia, and that means where did we come from? So the story is, and this is a family story, and I'm only repeating what I have learned in the family history. So my mother's mother had quite a story to tell. And she was quite a feisty woman. She was the youngest of what I know, three siblings, two brothers who were much older than her, and then herself. The one brother was a bookkeeper, what we would call a CA today, and things weren't going well for them in Germany. His mother was very ill. The opportunity came. They were looking for people in Namibia. And so he brought out his mother, and my grandmother at that time was only 12 years old when they came to Namibia. So before they came to Namibia, there is quite a story. So the story is that my grandmother's mother, so my great grandmother, was married to a what they called a Seemann in German. So he was on the sea. They came from Hamburg. So he got lost at sea with one of his ships sank, and he got lost at sea, which left the family in a very difficult situation because all of a sudden there was no more money coming in. At that time, my grandmother was a baby, and there was not enough food to feed her. And the story is that she then was placed into a care home, that like a children's home.
Afrikaans, we say a weeshuis or a foster home.
Yeah, it wasn't a foster home. It was more a government children's home.
Mm.
That is part of the story that I know. What then, there's a story that goes even further, that her grandmother had two children. The one was a son, and the other one was my grandmother's mother, my great grandmother.
Mm.
That family was extremely wealthy. Now my great grandmother was married to a developer. With other words, he was a construction guy, and he developed his own housing estates. And there was a whole street. It was a short street, but there were several houses in that street that were the properties. So they were extremely wealthy. And these children, so that the son was actually had everything going for him. And his father passed away before the war, and I'm believing it to be the First World War if I look at the time period. And this great uncle of mine was a soldier in the war, but he had a very, very bad habit of gambling. And he was
Even then, yeah.
He was a gambler, and he lost a lot in his betting. Was not married, was still young, and it ended up, the way he got more money out of his mother was he'd go to her, put a gun to his head, and say, if you don't get me out of this debt, I will shoot myself. And she then lost everything to his gambling debt, and it literally made her lose her mind. because in the end he did commit suicide, and she, as a result, landed in an asylum.
Mm.
When she found out that her grandchild was in a children's home, it shook something in her. And she then went and took this little girl out of the children's home at the age of about 3 or 4. So what we now know is that I ended up in a boarding school, but it's almost like this pattern is a repeat pattern.
Yeah.
So when my grandmother's mother lost her husband and they fell into poverty because there was nothing, it was very difficult for the family, and the mother then had cancer. And because this young man that was my grandmother's brother was educated, he felt he needed to be educated. So he came to Namibia and brought his brother, who was, I realized that he was in the jewelry trade. So he was a tradesman and then became a jeweler. And my grandmother was 12 years old when they came to Namibia. So the history, therefore, is that there is this legacy in the family of gambling, addiction, and that type of what we would call really difficult, because there was so much money, there was so much wealth, and it was all gone just because of that. So that's a tragedy that that I know of. So my grandmother, who was this 12-year-old coming to Namibia, she was a rather wild child. And if you look at her history, she didn't have a father, who died when she was a little girl, in this children's home, then with this grandmother who took her out of this children's home, but was also very lost in herself. And then when the grandmother died, going back, being transported to another country, and basically under the custodianship of her brother. And she and her brother didn't see eye to eye at all, because he tried to do the best he could, take care of his mother, and then this wild child, as she was known as. So here is the wild child.
So there's definitely a repeat of certain patterns and a recognition of certain aspects of the family tree that repeats itself until it's discovered and looked at.
Yes. So she fell pregnant at the age of 16. But before she fell pregnant, she didn't go to school. She worked in what we call a general dealer as and so she earned her own income, but she lived with her brother and her mother until the mother died. And there was this old man who always used to come into the general dealer, who was an ex-officer in the German force. But he, at that time, he was working on a farm and doing odd jobs around. But he used to come into this general dealer, and he fancied my grandmother a lot. And he always said, one day I will marry you. And she always said, not in this lifetime. So she had this real, he fancied her, and she had this total, you're too old for me, I have no fancy in you, etc., etc., until she fell pregnant. And then when he came home, she sat on his doorstep crying, and he said, what's the matter? And she said, I'm pregnant. And if I go home now, my brother will kill me. So he said, don't worry. He always said he was going to marry her. So he did the honorable thing, and he said, your child will have a name and I will marry you. So he was a good 25 years older than her. So he was a bachelor boy. He was just a very singular man, and he then got this gift of this woman that he always fancied, this young girl that he always fancied. And it did create a rift between my mother and my grandmother and her brother, who didn't speak to her for over a year because the shame she brought onto the family. So I understand this feeling of shame that he was trying to get away from in Germany, and here his sister is repeating another shame pattern. So he was devastated, but my just trying to work out, it was my uncle was born because he was first. So my uncle was born as basically without not knowing who his father is. So that's very interesting that this is a pattern that is also continuing. And then I believe that my aunt was then the old man's child, and then it is believed that my grandmother loved flirting with a lot of men. She was beautiful, she was vivacious, she was cheeky, she was a wild child, so she enjoyed life. So there is a rumor that my mother's father is not the husband's child.
Okay.
So there is always this little bit of secret that is in the family.